by saying tonight's shiur is Leilu Nishmat Avimori Dov Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi Mimoroti Rachel Bat Harav Michael. Tonight, of course, we're going to be talking about Toldot. So I will immediately switch to the source sheet. And I want to start with, let me just, how's this here? I want to start with a very simple, brief overview of the parsha. And then I'm going to throw out a couple of comments and open it up for some open microphone for everybody who wants to join. So first and foremost, the Parshat of Toldot is seen by many as kind of like the bridge parsha. It's like Avraham, we have a lot written about. Yaakov and his sons, we got a lot written about. Yitzchak seems to get squeezed into one parsha. And even in this parsha, where it's all about Yitzchak doesn't necessarily play the primary role in every one of the stories. So if we look at the different events that are recorded in the parsha, of course, first we have a brief overview of Yitzchak marrying Rivka, which we really read about in last week's parsha. And then we find out about Rivka's problems bearing children, birth of twin boys. And then the parsha sort of leaves Yitzchak and Rivka, tells us about this interaction between the two boys at some point in time. And it tells us about what we call the sale of the birthright, the story with the bowl of whatever the red stuff that Yaakov was cooking was. And then the parsha has a whole interlude of what I will call Yitzchak in Gerar, where the boys seemingly disappear from the story. Rivka appears almost, in the background. The primary drivers of that story are Avimelech and Yitzchak, and all these wells that are being dug and fought over. And then we have, of course, the most pivotal story in Jewish history, the story of Yaakov and Esav and the blessing from Yitzchak, which takes up I think is the most prominent portion of the part of the parsha. And I wanted to really focus primarily on the story of the birth of the twins and what precedes that, and the story of what happened that day with the birthright and the role of the different players in that thing. And primarily to show, I think that, at least from my perspective, the primary driver through all of that is not Yitzchak, it's not Yaakov, it's not Esav, it's Rivka. Rivka is the driving force. Just like Sarah, we saw in the story of Yishmael, the story of Hagar, that Sarah is a driving force in ensuring the continuity of the Jewish people. So too Rivka is going to play a very, very pivotal role in the formation of the Jewish people that are going to follow that generation. So without any further ado, we'll go right to the opening chapter of the Parsha, which you'll notice I've highlighted Yitzchak. Yitzchak seems to appear more than Rivka. Yitzchak mentioned 4 times, Rivka's only mentioned twice. Up here, he is mentioned again. But again, it seems as though we're going to see that Rivka seems to be the focal character in a couple of these in these narratives. So it tells us that these are generations. Yitzchak, son of Avram. Avram gave birth to Yitzchak, which is in and itself a very, very strange formulation. If Yitzchak is the son of Avram, obviously Avram is the father of Yitzchak. It seems a very, very strange formulation. Rashi comments on it by saying that the purpose of mentioning that Avram gave birth to Yitzchak was to tell us that they were very, very similar in their features, in their perspective, in their outlook. They were almost, if you would say, Yitzchak was almost a clone of Avraham Avinu. And as a matter of fact, there is a medrash that says the reason that tells us that Avram Zakein last week, when we read about Avram becoming old, that as the rabbi mentioned on Shabbat, that Avram said to God, hey, you got to make older people have a different way of looking, because if you have a son who looks exactly like the father, when he reaches a certain age, nobody can tell the difference between them if the father doesn't age. So we can all thank the fact that we aged to the patriarch Avram, who felt this was something that would help people as they reach a more mature age to look more distinguished, more distinguishable from the younger generation. So we can, at least that according to that measure. Okay, the story begins with Yitzchak being 40 years old. By the way, I've highlighted in our Parshat because we're going to see later on that another event in the parsha is going to happen when somebody is 40 years old. That's the only reason that's highlighted in gray. He marries Rivka, and he tells us immediately in verse 21 that Yitzchak prays Lashem l'nochach ishto. Now, this is a very strange word. These three purple phrases that I've highlighted here seem to be very, very strange grammatical concepts here. L'nochach ishto. L'nochach can mean opposite, against. And it seems strange if a couple is having trouble bearing children, I would have expected them to be going together, praying to God together, not one, as Rashi says on this phrase, the nochach ishto, that Yitzchak would pray in one corner of the room and Rivka would pray in the other corner of the room. I would think if you're praying for the same thing, if you're united, if you're together praying for the same result, you ought to be praying together because there's more power. We know that a community that prays is certainly stronger than a single person praying. And it seems, again, strange that there's this phrase, l'nochach ishto. Why are they praying separately? Why isn't there a harmony between them? Mechitza. I've never davened in a house where the husband and wife were the only two people and they needed a mechitza. I don't know. Maybe this is a new chumrah of the month, but it's like the equivalent of, okay, here we finished eating, we finished benching. Okay, let's put the mechitza up so the men can bench on this side, the women can bench on that side. It just doesn't seem to be. It seems a very strange formulation. Now, and as proof that they were davening individually, I've highlighted the next one. Vayatar lo Hashem. Hashem answers him. Again, interestingly enough, it's Yitzchak is the one who's praying. God answers him, and Rivka becomes pregnant. Very nice. But where's Rivka in this? Why isn't she praying? The assumption is that she's also praying. But again, God only hears and listens to, for some reason, as Rashi says, God hears the prayers of the righteous man, who's the son of the righteous man, before he hears the son of the righteous woman whose parents weren't as righteous. All right, that's what the Midrash says. But as I said, the fact that we would have expected, I would have expected the Torah to tell me that these two people are davening together, they're beseeching God together as a couple, saying, God, please grant us children, because otherwise, what purpose do we have as a couple? At least certainly when they're the only Jewish couple in the world, that's clearly a major problem if they're childless. Now, the Midrash says that all of the Mahot, with the exception of Leah, were childless because God wants to hear the prayers of the righteous. So that's I think the timer just went off. That's all. So that's an interesting, perspective of the thing that God often sends us challenges because he wants us to respond to those challenges. He doesn't want us to fail. And I think that the Midrash, by focusing this in that direction, says is really teaching us the same thing, that God wants us to seek him out when we are facing challenges in life and not to forget God. So all of this really sets the stage for this pregnancy. Now, interestingly enough, this is the first pregnancy that we're told something about the pregnancy. Normally it's they become pregnant, they have a baby, and the baby gets this name, and we move on to the story. Here, interestingly enough, what happened to my screen? Just died. Where did my screen just go? What happened to my screen? Page. Excuse me, pardon me. Okay, so it says here, "Rotetsu habanim b'kirba." Again, the word rotetsu itself is a very strange word. It's the only time it appears throughout the Tanakh. Larutz means to run. So and Rashi quotes the Midrash saying that the children were running while they were inside the womb. And Rashi gives this Midrashic interpretation that whenever they would pass some place that God was being learned about, Yaakov would be running to try to get out of the womb. And when they would pass the place, that was an improper place. Asa was trying to get out. But it seems that there was some complications in this pregnancy, at least from Rivka's perspective. She did not perceive this as a normal pregnancy. Vatomer, and she says, again, seems very strange. Who's she talking to? We would have expected it to say, Vatomer Abala. She's her spot. Who's she talking to? Imkain Lamazanofi. So it appears that it's not really Vatomer, it's really she's thinking to herself, why am I going through this? Is this the way every pregnancy works? What is it that why am I different that I am going through all of this torment in this pregnancy? But Telech lidrosh et Hashem. Here's next problem in this story. She goes to ask God. Okay, it makes sense. Why does she have to go to ask God? She's got Yitzchak living right with her. Where is she going to ask God? And why does she have to go to ask God? Okay, there are two different schools of thought in the Midrashim. One says that the person she went to ask to inquire of God was Avraham. The other says that it was Shem, Noach's son, who she went to. Each of these, again, begs the question, why isn't she going to her husband? Why does she have a problem? Just like, why does she have a problem approaching him and saying, let's daven together? Why does she have a problem approaching him and saying, hey, I've got a problem with this pregnancy. Can you give me some support here and help me out and understand what's going on? So she's looking for an answer, and she knows that the answer is clearly to ask God. She doesn't go to her gynecologist to find out what's wrong or her medical practitioner. She goes to God because there's something that to her seems totally out of whack with this pregnancy. But again, the fact that she's not going to Yitzchak seems to me to say that there seems to be an inability on Rivka's part to approach Yitzchak. At least that's what it seems from the verses. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but and that's going to play out as we go through the story, at least from my perspective, that Rivka is in awe, if you will, of Yitzchak and is afraid to approach him with any questions or any discussion. There's only one place where we're going to see at the end of the story where it says that Rivka and Yitzchak have a conversation. We have conversations recorded about Sarah and Avram. We have conversations between Yaakov and his wives. There's only one time where we have Rivka and Yitzchak having any conversation together. And that's all the way at the end of the story, which we'll get to, Bezrat Hashem. Okay, so God answers her. God says, okay, you need an answer, legitimate question. And the answer very simply is Shnei Goyim b'vitnech. There are two different nations inside your womb. So the first answer to her first question is it's not one kid that's schizophrenic or is going crazy. You got two different kids. You have twins in there. So they're probably busy jostling each other, probably had a little bit more movement. I don't know. I've never done a survey of women who've had twins versus women who have had single births, or a same woman comparing her pregnancy with twins versus a pregnancy with a single child in terms of movement, in terms of discomfort, pain, whatever, in terms of dealing with childbirth. So I don't know. I've never, it's not something I've ever taken a survey on. But clearly God, by saying this, seems to resolve all her issues. Saying, Shnei Goyim b'vitnech. Now, but it's not just enough to tell her she's going to have twins. Ushnei li'umim mime'ayich yiparedu. Now, li'um means power. There are two powerful nations, basically, that are going to come and yiparedu. They will be completely separated from the time they're born, which again seems that Rivka should have had a little bit of insight here that I'm dealing with two very, very different children. And this is a very, very poetic, but strange to hard, challenging to one of these powers, milaom, from the other power, ye'ematz, will be stronger, will gain strength, which seems to imply that they're going to be constantly striving with one another, and that one will always be ascendant. You won't have both ascendant at the same time. You won't have both not existent on the world scene at the same time. At least that's the way many of the Midrashim take this phrase of La'om, Mila'om, Ye'ematz, that these two are going to continually be jousting over control of the destiny of Avraham. Let's put it that way. And the Gemara itself says a very simple phrase. If you hear it says basically the same thing. If somebody tells you that both, that Israel and Rome are both ascendant, don't believe me. He tells you both Rome and Israel have fallen off the map, don't believe me. He tells you one is ascendant, one is not doing so well, then you can believe him. It doesn't matter which way. But it's almost as if they're on a seesaw, that they are counterbalancing each other or weighing one another. And then the last phrase in this words of God Torah, V'rav Yavod Tza'ir. And again, the question is how we translate it. If I look at it, it's a very, very strange, because if I translate this in the very literal sense, and I'm sure that you'll find this in many translations, V'rav, the greater one, Yavod Tza'ir, will serve the younger one. Now, Rav has a number of different meanings. Rav can mean the one that's more numerous, can mean the one that's stronger. It can also mean the older. Yavod Tza'ir will serve the younger one. And if we look at the truck, the way the Torah, it's reading, it's V'rav, pause, Yavod Tza'ir. On the other hand, we can also read it V'rav Yavod, the Rav will rule over Tza'ir, the younger one. So there are different ways to understand this pasuk, but as I said, the literal simple meaning is V'rav Yavod Tza'ir, that the younger one will be the one who is served by the older one. Okay. Vayimlu Yamel, she carries to full term, which we will see, which not always the case with twins. And now this is very strange here. The fact that the Torah now tells us that there are twins seems completely out of place here. Which the prophet just told her in God's name that there were two nations inside you. So what would we have expected? We would expect it to. Why does the Torah introduce v'hinei, behold, wow, something totally unexpected? They were twins. Samson Raphael Hirsch using this word v'hinei, saying v'hinei always introduces something that wasn't necessarily expected, something new and not necessarily, something we would have expected from before. He says that the strange thing about Esav and Yaakov was that they were not fraternal twins. They were identical twins. Oh, wait, how can they be identical twins? One was, we're going to see in the next pasuk, one comes out below Kaderet Se'ar, and the other one comes out as each tam, each chalak. But if you go through the cases of twins, you will find oftentimes that it can happen that because of the development and the way they're positioned inside the womb, that one of them is getting much more nutrition than the other, and becomes much more developed within the womb than the other, even though they may very well be identical twins. And it will take, and they will never, you won't look at them, they won't look identical at birth, because one is much more closer to fully developed than the other, because one has been getting more of the nourishment and the attention of the womb, I guess, because of the way they're situated within the womb. But that's what Hirsch's commentary. As I said, that's not necessarily everybody's opinion that they were identical twins as opposed to fraternal twins. Anyway, but again, the phrase "Binei Tomim B'Bitna" could just be saying that yes, the prophecy, obviously what the prophet told her, obviously came true, that she had twins, as opposed to one child who was then going to have two children that were going to go in different directions. Okay. Interesting thing enough, the first one comes out, he's Admoni, Kulo Kader Tzervai, Yikreu Shemo Esav. They called his name Esav. Now, it doesn't tell us who the they is, but when Yaakov is born, it says, Vayikra Shemo Yaakov. Interestingly enough, Esav is named by more than one person, Vayikreu. Yaakov is named by one. Of course, the Rashi quoting the Midrash says, Vayikru, is everybody called his name Esav because he looked so fully developed because of all the hair. And when it came to Yaakov, it says God's the one who called his name Yaakov, so that we should always remember that we come on the heel of Esav. As a matter of fact, the Midrash quotes a statement by in different names in one Midrash, in the other Midrash is Rabban Gamliel, that says that that Yaakov will follow on the heels of Esav is referring to some distant future where when the Romans, whoever the Romans are, when they find their spiritual descendants finally cede power over the world, it will be the Jews who will ultimately lead the world to its true destiny. nice midrash, but again, not the literal meaning of the verse. The literal meaning of the verse is that Jacob is holding on for dear life to try to keep Esau from being born first. At least that's the general way we look at it. And the Torah tells us that Yitzchak is 60 years old when they're born, which tells us that the entire period that she's barren, that there's a 20-year period between the time they're married and the time they have children. Okay. And the next two verses are very, very quick. The early rearing of the children, Vayigdalu hanarim, generally Vayigdalu hanarim gadol, because they became gadol means they reached the age of 13. Or they reached the age where they were no longer dependent on the parents totally, and they were no longer children. And at this point, they clearly had two very different outlooks on life. Esav is the outdoor guy. Yaakov is the student who sits and studies all day. And interestingly enough, the Torah tells us a very, very telling, seemingly, that the parents each have seemingly a favorite. Okay, so if we look at these two psukim by Yitla and Narim, that they are raised, and the verse 28, that Yitzchak seems to favor one and Rivka seems to favor the other, looks like we're already setting up for challenges, problems down the road. First and foremost, the Vayigdalu Hanarim seems to imply that the education they have in their formative years was joint education. They were both raised at the same table, same lesson plan, the same everything. This is a major problem. When Rivka understood that she had two very, very different children, one would have thought that she would have engaged a different education plan for each of the children to make sure that they were both tailored to their instinct, their individual strengths. Example, you have one child who's an artist, and the other who's a mathematician. You're not going to force the mathematics guy to do art projects all day, and you're not going to you shouldn't be. I mean, unfortunately, in many schools they do, but you shouldn't be forcing the one who's very artistic to be doing math and chemistry and physics and biology, as their primary course of study, because you're not going to get the optimal results. Education should be, unfortunately, as I said, once you introduce the concept of universal education, it makes it very challenging. But here we're not talking about universal education. They weren't going to the public school, the school down the block. They were going presumably to the school where they were being taught one-on-one or maybe one-on-two. But you would have thought that they would have understood that we're dealing with two different personalities and tried to tailor the lesson plan as such. Clearly, also the fact that we have, as I said, we have each parent having a favorite gives us the fact that there's going to be challenges down the road, or at least leads us to believe that. Now, I have three dots there because I'm now skipping the whole story with the sale of the porridge, skipping the whole story about the wells, and we're going directly to the last two verses of chapter 26, which in the Torah are a separate chapter. And this is the last two psukim we have before we get into the whole story about the blessing. And this is the only thing that we know about Esav other than his birth. He's a ish tzayid, ish sadeh. Yitzchak loves him because he tzayid b'fiv, whatever that means, and that he agrees to sell the birthright. That's all we know about Esav until we get to this verse. So 40 years have passed since their birth. At this point, when he's 40 years old, Esav decides to get married. He takes two wives, Yehudit bat be'eri hachiti, bet basmat bat elon hachiti. Two Hittite women as wives, and the verse, and that should have been the end of the chapter. Okay, he takes two wives, very nice. Just like his father at age 40 got married, he decides to get married at age 40. But the pasuk adds Vatiyenu morat ruach liYitzchak ula Rivka. So these two become I don't know. I translate a thorn in the side of a problematic. Morat ruach means something that drains the spirit. They were not happy with his choice of wives, perhaps. Okay, or again, it doesn't say, how often they came to visit, how often they interacted. It doesn't say. But here, at least, we don't have a difference. We have both Yitzchak and Rivka. If it had said Vatiyanu Ruach the Rivka, we would have understood. Rivka didn't, Esav's already in the outs already. but it says equally Yitzchak and Rivka. And you have to keep this in mind as we get to the next chapter, because we're going to see that it's Yitzchak is the one who's going to call Esav in and say, okay, even though he has a problem with his wife. So let's go to chapter 27, which as it immediately follows on the heels of this information. We don't know how many years have passed, but we know that by the time chapter 27 arrives, Yitzchak has already become old. Vayiki zaken Yitzchak, as Yitzchak gets old, and I split this into two different sides. My left between your right side is Yitzchak's interaction with Esav, and the other side is Rivka's interaction with Yaakov. And it's going to be very interesting that we're going to see a very, very interesting comparison between Yitzchak instructing Esav, Yaakov being instructed by Rivka as we go to this chapter. Okay, so let's go first to your right side, my left side. Vayiki zaken Yitzchak. As Yitzchak gets older, it says that his eyes had grown weak. He could no longer see. He's basically home blind. He can't go out and do all the things that he would do, but his mind is still there. He's sharp. He's got all his faculties about him, but he can't see where he's going. And he didn't have, they didn't have all these aids for blind people back then. So he calls Esav his older son. Vayomer love B'ni. He calls him my son. Vayomer love Hinen. He says, here I am. That's the introduction to what he's going to ask him. Okay. Vayomer, he says, I am getting old. I don't know how long I'm going to live. Rashi brings a very, very interesting midrash, trying to date this event. He says that at this point, Yitzchak has reached his 123rd year, and therefore he is within 5 years of the age at which his mother passed away. And he says most people are going to pass away within 5-year period of time. They're going to live to an age that is within 5 years of one or the other of their parents. So Yitzchak saying, I don't know if I'm going to die within 5 years of my mother's age or 5 years of my father. His father lives to the rightful age of 175. And in the end, Yitzchak does live to 180 years, which is exactly 5 years difference from Abraham. But here he says, I don't know. I have no idea. Maybe I'm going to die within 5 years of my mother's life. And she was much younger. So therefore he tells him, son, okay, go out, take your hunting tools, and go out into the fields and hunt something for me. Make for me a tasty dish like I love. And bring it to me, and I will eat. In order that my soul can bless you before I die. Interesting enough, Esav has no response, no complaint. Dad says, do it. What happens? If we look at the second half of verse 5, we will skip the first half till we go to the top and the other side. His father said, say Hasadeh, go out and bring me something to hunt. He goes out and he brings something to hunt. He does exactly what his father asked him to do. No questions asked. Now we go to the second side of the story. Okay, which as I said, really begins with verse 5. Rivka shomat v'daber Yitzchak el Esav. Now Rivka had heard what Yitzchak had to say to Esav, and then Esav goes out, and now Rivka, as soon as Esav has left, Rivka Amra el Yaakov ben Alimah. Rivka calls in Yaakov and tells him, and she gives him an introduction. I heard what your father just instructed Esav. Here's what he told him. Bring me something to it, and I will bless him. Now she gives him instructions, which are very, very similar to the instructions that Esav just got from Yitzchak. There are contrasts, but there are also similarities. Okay? Yitzchak never tells Esav, you have to listen to what I'm telling you to do. Rivka opens by those words. Listen to what I'm telling you have to do. So she's already invoking parental command. At the beginning, she's saying, you must listen. I'm commanding you. I'm commanding you. Not I'm asking you to do me a favor. I'm commanding you to do the following. And that's going to be very important when we try to analyze the position of the different players here. Bring me 2 kids in, and I am going to cook them, prepare them for a tasty dish for your father like he loves. But your job after you bring me these 2, you're going to have to bring it in to your father to eat, so that he will bless you before he dies. Okay, again, the same concept of being blessed before he dies, that he commands Esav. She repeats that same thing to Yaakov. But again, it's not, you can do this or not. It's, I'm commanding you to do this. Okay, that's key word in this. Okay, now, yeah, Yaakov does, again, Esav, when his father told him to do it, no questions. He immediately goes out and do it. What's Yaakov's first response? I think we got a problem here, Mom. Vayomer Yaakov Rivka imo. He says, wait a minute. Hein Esav achi yisleven ochishloch. We all know the story. My brother's a hairy guy. I don't have that kind of hair. My father's going to feel me. He's going to think I'm tricking him, and he's going to end up not giving me a bracha, but a klala. His mother answered him, alai tilalat chabani. Whatever curse your father gives you should be upon me. Ach shma b'koli v'let kafli. Again, same phraseology. Listen and do it. Don't ask questions. I'm not asking you to be logical, rational, or thinking what you do. You're doing this because I am telling you, you must do it. Okay? His mother said, I got to do it. She told me twice. I got to do it. Okay? And that's basically the end of Yaakov's involvement at this point. He brings it to his mother prepares. Okay, now we come to the second part. Rivka has already precluded, and we know the story. We know she's thought about his concern. So she takes the big day Esav Nagal of the Mudot. She takes certain of Esav's clothes that he happened Asheri Tava Bayit. Now think about it. If Esav's already 40, he was already married. Now if Yitzchak is 123, they're 63. It appears that he's not living at home. You know, Yitzchak didn't just call him. He probably sent a messenger, said, "Come, I need to talk to you." And so the fact that he has clothes still in his parents' house says something. And the Medrash wants to say that he had special clothes that he would use. He would have a nice set of wonderful clothes because when he went to help to serve his father, to be with his father, to spend time with his father, he didn't want to be dressed in his sweaty, disgusting clothes that he used out in the field. He wanted to have a fresh set of clothes when he came to visit his father, which shows us, Midrash wants to say, how seriously Esav took this mitzvah of honoring his father. Again, it's interesting because all of the Parshanim talk about Esav and Kibud Av. They don't say anything about Esav and Kibud Aim. However, I don't know what his relationship with his mother is. Torah never, except in almost one hinting word, will tell us anything about a relationship between Rivka and Esav. There seems to have been almost non-existent, at least from the Torah's perspective. Now, maybe it was a wonderful relationship. The Torah therefore didn't need to say anything about it because it was perfectly normal that a son should have a wonderful relationship with his mother. But I suspect because of this way that the Torah describes his relationship with his father and alludes to it here, I think there may have been some, different way that Rivka looked at everything. And that's, as I say, one of the things we want to try to understand a little more. Okay, we know what happens. She dresses him and she puts the skins from the goats on his hands and on the neck, the smooth part of his neck, but obviously Esav also had a hairy neck and shoulders. So that Yaakov is now prepared for his father to feel him, at least in one sense. She gives the food, he goes, he brings it in. His father says, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm Esav." And please, now, interestingly enough, he used a very interesting phrase. He says, "Kum na shiva." Please get up and recline, because again, obviously he was sitting in the chair and he needs to go over to the reclining the table where he's going to eat. And Yitzchak says, "Wait a minute, how'd you come so quickly?" And he says, "Kihikra Hashem Elokecha lefanai," because God helped me out. I got there quickly. Yitzchak, of course, puts Yaakov to the dreaded test that Yaakov was afraid of. He comes, calls Mora, "Let me feel you." He feels him, and he utters that immortal phrase, "Hakol tol Yaakov ayodai midei Esav." The hands are the hands of, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, the hands are the hands of Esav. Again, Yitzchak senses that I'm not sure. I think it's Yaakov, but why does he feel like Esav? But it sounds like Yaakov. Now, again, if we say they were fraternal twins, it seems strange that he couldn't tell the difference between them, or that he had a problem. But if they were identical twins, go back to the original thesis we started with, then it's entirely possible their voices were so similar that it wasn't that easy to distinguish between them. Just a possibility, okay? Okay. He did Velohi Kiro in verse 23 very clearly says Velohi Kiro. He did not recognize him Ki Hayu Yadav Kidei Esav Achiv Sirot because of the hairy hands. He didn't recognize him and Vayavarchei. Then he tries to engage him again in conversation again because maybe he hasn't had. It's not like they've been talking for 20 minutes. They had a brief exchange of words. So he now wants to wait. Now that I'm really still questioning whether this is Yaakov, maybe if we have a longer discussion, maybe I'll be able to tell by the voice who this is I'm really talking to. And the conversation, Yaakov answers him in one word, Ani. That's all he says. Ani. It's me. Then he says, okay, bring me the food. He blesses him. And again, he hugs him, he smells him. He tries to use all of the possible ways to identify who this really is. But in the end, he is willing to accept the fact that it may be Esau, and he gives him this blessing. Okay, so then we go back right after. Now, again, we talk about timing being everything, right? The verse tells us, verse 30, as we go now to the other side of the diagram, okay? As soon as Yitzchak had finished blessing Yaakov, Yaakov had literally just left the room that Yitzchak was in. And Esav enters the tent from his hunting. Of course, the Midrash says that this was not purely coincidental, that Hashem made sure that he had a little extra trouble finding something so that Yaakov could get the bracha. But again, that's the Midrash. But clearly the pasuk clearly says that Yaakov was able to get the bracha and leave before Esav shows up. And again, he also makes nice dish for his father. But again, note the contrast. What does he say to his father when he comes in? Yakum Avi. Come on, Dad, get up and eat. So you can give me a blessing. You asked me, he said me to do it. I did it. Do it. As opposed to Yaakov's more genteel, please get up. Yaakov saying, God has helped me. As I said, there were two schools in the Midrash. One says that it was the tone of voice, but the other one simply says that it was the choice of words that Yaakov used that almost got him tripped up because Esav didn't use similar phraseology. Interesting. Again, Esav never mentions or invokes God, whereas Yaakov does. And this concept of humna, just the fact that he says, please, God, come on, get up, as opposed to, Dad, get up. Now, the key phrase, I think, is verse 33, at least in terms of understanding Yitzchak's perspective after he realizes he's given the bracha to Yaakov. Okay, Yaakov, clearly once Esav walks in and says, I'm Esav, here's the food, what's happening? Yitzchak realizes, all along I thought it might have been Yaakov, and I guess he was able to figure out that now he knows it's Yaakov. But the interesting response is, I'm going to stop before I go to verse 33. I'm going to poll the people here. You just called your older son in for a blessing. The younger son came in masquerading as the older brother. You gave him a blessing. What's your first response when you find out you gave the blessing to the wrong person? What would be your first response? Outrage. Okay. What would be your second response? Well, how would you treat the younger son now? Let's ask it that way. What would you do? I mean, clear answer, at least from the logical perspective, you say, blessing's off. Right? Obviously, if he took it under false pretenses, how can you have a blessing obtained under false pretenses? I don't know. Yes, no? Does that make sense? I mean, clearly, if this is a blessing that God, again, let's go back to the words of the blessing. God is going to bless you. How can God bless somebody when a blessing is obtained under false pretenses? Maybe Isaac really realized it was Yaakov. But if he realizes it was Yaakov, then why does he give him a blessing? Why does he say, wait a minute, you're not Esav, you're Yaakov? In other words, he certainly had a question. He certainly was not 100% sure that it was Yaakov, and he certainly wasn't 100% sure that it was Esav. So why does he give him the blessing in the first place? That's question number one. And question number two is, why, after he finds out that it really was Yaakov, doesn't he immediately say, oh, he took the blessing under false pretenses, I'm rescinding the blessing? Okay.
That he was upset.
Vayecharad Yitzchak.
His immediate response is Gambor Rivka.
He should also be blessed. Okay. Okay, so what you're saying is that Yitzchak, even though his first instinct is to say, wait a minute, he can't have this blessing. He came under false pretenses. But you're saying that Yitzchak now realizes, and that's the last three words of the pasuk that I've just highlighted, are Yigam Baruch, yeah, he should also be blessed. Because Yitzchak realizes, wait a minute, if God sent Yaakov in here, or Yaakov himself came in somehow, and God allowed me to bless him, that must mean that God wants him to get that blessing. So it's almost as if he's acknowledging after the fact that maybe the fact that I wanted to give Esav this bracha was maybe not the right thing. Maybe God didn't want this blessing to go to Esav. Is there a parallel with Eliezer? Well, in what sense, David? I'm only repeating it so the people on the Zoom can hear it. Go ahead. So you're saying that Yitzchak's intent is whichever son shows up is the right one? Oh, but that's his acceptance. In other words, he's accepting after the fact that whichever son was the one that showed up is the one that God really wanted to get the blessing. Well, maybe that's a possibility, but that wasn't what he intended in the first place. And in other words, his focus in the first place, he has no idea that Yaakov is even in the picture until he comes in and he says, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. Well, that's clear. The nature of the blessing is clearly something we're going to look at. I hope we're going to have enough time. Okay. But clearly, again, Yitzchak's first reaction, as Yossi pointed out, as we read in Lamed Gimel, is Vayecharad Yitzchak Charada Gedola Ad Ma'od. This is very, very strange. Not that Vayecharad, okay, he was trembling, but it was a great trembling, Ad Ma'od, exceedingly great trembling. The Torah uses 4 words to describe how shaken he is by this revelation that he's given the bracha to the wrong son. And his first response, he goes out, wait a minute, if you're Esav, who was that masked man who came in and I gave a blessing to? But he says, and instead of saying, wait a minute, he's going to be cursed, which is what Yaakov was afraid was going to happen when Yitzchak realized, he says, Gam Baruch Yeh. He acknowledges, I've already given him this blessing. That must mean, as maybe perhaps as Yos says, that he acknowledges and realizes that God wanted him to get the blessing. Okay. The rest of the story is, again, we're familiar with. Esav cries out. He gives him a different blessing. And ultimately, we find that Esav is upset with Yaakov, and Yaakov has to ultimately run away. But I wanted to now that we've gone through the basic points of the story, I wanted to focus on the 2 key players in the story. Again, one being clearly Rivka, the other being Yitzchak. And I'm sorry, Yaakov, excuse me. And try to understand what are the thoughts going through their mind as they're going through this event. Now, clearly, just like I asked, we can't. Yeah, that's like Yaakov says to his mother, if I go in and I try to get this blessing, and my father realizes it's me, he's not going to want to give me a blessing. That clearly, obviously, if his father isn't going to want to do it, what about God? How can I do what? Why does Yaakov not say to his mother, wait a minute, how can I do this? What's God going to say? Why isn't anybody? I mean, Yaakov says, oh, my father, God help me out. Why doesn't he say that to his mother? That, how can I do this? And still look God and answer to God. So let's go back a couple of steps. First question, does anybody other than Rivka know about what she was told at the beginning of the parsha? Does she ever share that with anybody? That's the first question. No, the person who told her clearly told her. Vayomer Hashem Ulah, God tells her. He doesn't tell Yitzchak. He doesn't, and clearly Yaakov and Esav, who aren't even born at the time, clearly don't know about it. And we get the impression that this is not shared with anybody. So clearly it appears that she has kept this information this entire time private. What she was told, There's nowhere the Torah says, oh, and she went and told Yitzchak what was going on. That she keeps this to herself. Now, when this critical juncture arrives, she's got in the back of her mind, okay, we know it says Rivka have it at Yaakov. She loved Yaakov. And she's got in her mind that, wait a minute, this bracha has got to go to Yaakov. That's her focus. But why doesn't she go in and talk to Yitzchak about it? Again, same question we've talked about, we wrestled with perhaps before. Why is Rivka keeping all this information up and then resorting to this masquerade rather than just saying, Yitzchak, hey, come on, what's going on here? Why do you want to give Esav a bracha? Don't you know who his wives are? Don't you know what's going to happen to his kids? They're not going to be Jewish kids. He's not married to a woman who's even connected, who even has a possibility of raising kids who are going to be dedicated to Avram's mission. We are here to try to raise that, to keep Avram's mission alive. How can you even think of including Esav? Why doesn't she say that to him? Okay, that's a possibility. She doesn't want to take a chance that he's going to disagree. But okay, so you're saying she basically just takes the law into her own hands because she needs this to happen. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. So it seems. Yes. I mean, that's, I hope everybody heard that. David basically said that she felt she had to take some action to ensure the proper or the appropriate resolution. And that's clear from her actions. I mean, she clearly feels that what she's doing is appropriate. No matter how we slice it, she obviously felt that she had to do this because it was the only way that she was going to ever be able to make an impact here and make sure that the right son, or from her perspective, got the blessing. Well, not only might he interpret it, but again, as David said, he might totally disagree and say, no, I think Esav is a critical component to this nation. I mean, because again, if we look at the blessings that Yaakov gets when Yitzchak thinks he's Esav versus the bracha that he gives him later on when he leaves to go to Lavan, they're two different blessings. One is talking about physical, the other is talking about spiritual values. And perhaps many of the commentators, I think Loes and others suggest that Yitzchak had a vision. Yitzchak's vision of the Jewish people was that Esav and Yaakov would work together, where Esav would be the one running the government, running the business, and Yaakov would be running the Beit HaMikdash, the yeshivot, the education portfolio would be Yaakov, while let's say the defense and the economic portfolios would go to Esav, because they were supposed to both share in building this nation. And that's Yitzchak's vision, and therefore he's going to give each of them an appropriate blessing so that that nation can be formed. That's Yitzchak's vision. Rivka clearly disagrees with that vision completely. So when you say that he wasn't going to agree with her, it again, whether they actually literally spoke about this, don't know. But clearly they have two different perspectives. Rivka's perspective is that Esav cannot be part of it, even though he may be my son. He can't be part of it, just like Yishmael couldn't be part of it. Esav can't be part of it. That's her perspective. David, go ahead.
That's what happens. But when you do that, you see.
Absolutely. Definitely there are consequences. For those who are on the call, David just said that Rivka's decision was that the end justifies the means, and yet obviously as a result, there are consequences that are going to come out of that. And that's definitely true. Yossi has a comment. Go ahead. Yes.
Yaakov clearly had some kind of a premonition. The fact that he wanted the Bechorah in the first one. It felt justified in doing it in this, I don't want to say underhand, but odd way of getting it.
Okay. Torah doesn't say whether anybody else knew about that deal. So you're saying that Yaakov's justification for agreeing to his mother's wishes and not raising, hey, what's God going to say, was strictly because he had already made this deal with Esau, and he knew he was entitled to it. That's if you say that this Bechorah that he sent him is the same as this bracha that he's getting from his father. Bechorah, bracha, I'm not so sure those are the same things or have the same implications. That's a whole different story and a whole different drasha that'll take forever. And we'll never know the answer to. But okay, that's a valid concern. I mean, perhaps, as I said, perhaps the fact that we have this story before with the sale of birthright might help us explain Yaakov's position. I think very simply that Yaakov's position is very simply, I have no choice. My mother said I got to do it. I got to do it. That's it. And while we might not feel that way about what if our parents told us something, perhaps that was the way he felt that strongly about his relationship. If mom says I'm supposed to do it, it must be the right thing to do. Not that I'm going to blindly follow whatever mom says. I don't see right now how this is the right thing to do. But if mom says it's the right thing to do, I got to trust her. I think that's what Yaakov is going on. Okay. There's a little bit of sorrow in that. Again, it's sorrow. Yeah.
Is that they're almost trying the Torah Yeah, no, but again, he's not suggesting what I'm suggesting is that Yaakov's perspective is that my mother knows what she's doing, and if she is telling me to do it, it's obviously correct, both from her perspective as the wife and my perspective as the son. So even though it might look like it's inappropriate, it must be right. That's why I'm going along and doing it. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, clearly both Rivka and Yaakov understand that he is going to get found out as soon as Esau comes back. Once Esau returns, the gig is up. We know Yitzchak's going to know. The question is that going to be before, during, after? And if it's after or before, during, what's Yitzchak's response going to be afterwards, or when he finds out? Because he has to find out. It's impossible. He's not going to find out, and that's what makes the whole thing so strange. You were going to say something. Go ahead. Oh, okay. So I want to just quote. I think it's Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's commentary. He says we have to understand that Rivka is not doing this because she has. I mean, she's doing it because she has a vision. But the reason she's trying to do this is because she feels this is the only way she can help Yitzchak understand something about his sons. Okay. Now, if we go back to the original thing where the pasuk where it says, "Vayahav Yitzchak et Esav kitzayid b'fiv." Now we translate that literally means because he gave him food to eat. He hunted and he hunted food that was in his mouth. But Rashi quotes the midrash that says kitzayid b'fiv means that he used his mouth to hunt his father. That he used his words to deceive his father and make his father believe he was something other than what he was. And the Midrash says, he would ask all sorts of real frummy questions to make his father believe he was a real frum. He'd ask him about the chumrah of the month. What's the chumrah of the month, Abba? And in different ways. And I guess that would be the equivalent if somebody were writing a parish like Rashi today. And he tried to convince his father. Now, what Rivka is trying to do is to show Yitzchak that it's easy for you to be deceived. Remember, Yitzchak grows up in the house of Avram and Sarah. He is a trusting soul. He lives with two parents who are yashar, honest. They have a problem, they speak about it. They have an issue, it comes out. It's not hidden under the blankets. It's not behind the back. Sarah has a problem. Here's the problem, Avram. Avram has something. Sarah, let's do this. There's no hiddenness. There's no behind the back. There's no masquerading. So he takes Esau at face value.
He takes Yaakov at face value. He knows what he's got. He knows he's got a son who's a student, but not a man of the world. He knows he's got a son who's a man of the world and not a student. So he wants to take each of those, utilize those skills to build a nation that's going to fuse those two skills and make a very strong nation. But Rivka realizes, again, and I think the Torah specifically mentions about who Esav marries directly before we have this story, because Rivka realizes who Esav really is in a way that Yitzchak can't, because remember, she's grown up in a very different environment, been raised in a very different environment, in an environment, and we're going to find out a little bit more about her brother next week. And so she understands a little bit more about how the world works and how people can be not yashar, upright, true. And that perhaps, according to as I said, I think it's substantial first, is why what she is trying to do is to show Yitzchak that just like Esav can masquerade as a righteous individual, so too Yaakov can masquerade as an Esav, to almost, if you will, force him to come to grips with the fact that everything isn't as it seems. Now, if I were going to do this, I would say,
But
hey,
why does she do it in such?
I'm sorry. Well, go ahead, Avis. What was the question? I didn't hear the second half of the question.
Why does she do it in such an underhand way?
Why does she do it in such an underhanded way? No, because she wants it to be set up in such a way
she's
that
lying
Yitzchak,
to him.
Avis, she wants Yitzchak to be able to see for himself how easily he can be deceived by somebody who is looking like someone else. And she hopes that this will cause him to realize how he's been deceived. I don't know. As I said, it seems to me that the way you would do that is to confront him, but obviously she's not willing to confront him. That's, as I said, that's the story that we've seen running through this relationship. She is not willing to confront him. She's not willing to, she doesn't confront Esav ever. As I said, it seems from the Torah, with the exception of one pasuk that I hope I'll have time to get to in a minute, that she has no relationship whatsoever with Esav after he's born. She's kind of already written him off. Okay, so while it says that Yitzchak loves him, it says Rivka loves Yaakov. It doesn't say anything about what Rivka's relationship with Esav is, or for that matter, what Yitzchak's relationship with Yaakov is. But at least we surmise from the fact that he's willing and accepts the fact that in reality, after the fact, when he finds out that it wasn't Esav, he says, okay, he should get the blessing, means that he obviously does understand a little bit about Yaakov. And as we're going to see in a minute, let me go back to the end of the parsha, which I wanted to go quickly to. After this whole thing expires and it transpires, and Yitzchak calls, again says, Rivka says to Yitzchak, I'm sick of these benot chet. I want Yaakov to marry a proper wife. He's got to go find a good wife. And Yitzchak calls Yaakov in, and vayevarech oto, he gives him a blessing. This is, by the way, the last chapter of the parsha. Yitzchak calls Yaakov in. This is after all the whole story with what's happened. He gives him a blessing. Vayitzavehu, vayomer lo, he commands him, lo tikach isha mibnot Canaan. Do not marry a Canaanite woman as one any doors of Canaan as your wife. You unlike me, who had a servant go from Kumlech Padan Aram, you get up and go to Padan Aram, to the house of Besuel, your mother's brother, or your mother's father, and take a wife from the daughters of Lavan, your mother's brother. Okay, so clearly Yitzchak knew who Yaakov was. He understood that he's going to be the bearer of the Abrahamic tradition. And that's exactly what he says in verse 4. Suddenly here, Yitzchak realizes that it's going to be Yaakov only, not Yaakov and Esav, and he transfers to him the blessing of Avram to inherit Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that conclusion really there tells us that Yitzchak clearly knew who the future of the Jewish people was going to be in the hands Whether he knew it at the time of the blessing, I don't think so. I think when he calls Esav in, his expectation is that they're both going to be part of it. But when he realizes, as perhaps was suggested, that maybe the fact that God allowed him to bless Yaakov means that it was supposed to be only Yaakov, he accepts that because he knows who Yaakov is. And perhaps by now he's gotten some more insight into Esav. I don't know. His beloved son is now, clearly there are a lot of things going on in his head when Esav shows up and he realizes he's blessed Yaakov. And there have been Midrash interpretations what he was, but clearly part of that is, okay, so now what's Esav's role? And then he gives Esav this bracha that says, okay, you're going to be your own nation, but you're going to always be at odds with your brother. It's almost as if when the bracha he gives Esav, he's saying, it's almost as if he heard what was told to Rivka. It's almost as if he's setting up this exactly what Rivka heard, was told, that they're going to be two powers always, at odds with one another. That's what it seems Yitzchak sets up by saying, you'll serve your brother, but when you rebel, you'll be able to overcome him. You'll be able to take his yoke from your shoulders. But again, that whole point of what the bracha he gives to Esav afterwards, after he's already given the other bracha that he thought he was going to give Esav to Yaakov, by then he's realized that they're going their separate ways. They're not going to be part of the same nation. And he solidifies this here when he tells Yaakov as he's leaving to go find a wife, okay, you're going to come back here. You are the one who's going to carry on the Abrahamic tradition exclusively. And that seems to be a given. Now, then the Torah adds a very interesting verse here. And I'm going to quote, I wanted to end with this. Yaakov leaves as his father commands him. But then it says, Lavan ben Betulah Arami Achti Rivka, Lavan, who is the brother of Rivka, and then it adds three words, Aim Yaakov ve'esav, the mother of Yaakov ve'esav. And Rashi has a very strange comment on these three words. He says, I don't know what the Torah is trying to tell us by adding these words, Aim Yaakov ve'esav. What's the Torah trying to tell us? We know Rivka's Yaakov and Esav's mother. But I think what the Torah is trying to tell us, and this is not original, but I don't remember where I saw it, so I apologize. But the Torah is trying to tell us that even though if we read everything up through here, we would say, well, Rivka had no relationship with Esav. Torah tells us clearly that Rivka, just as much as she loved Yaakov, she loved Esav. But she also was realistic about who he was and what role he was going to play or not play in the future of the nation. And that's why she feels she has to take matters into her own hand to ensure that these two nations go their separate way already, because she realizes, to go back to the marriage, that Esav's children, maybe Esav himself might have been suitable, perhaps because of his great relationship with his father, but clearly his children, who are going to be raised by these other women, were not going to be suitable. And I think that's the key lesson that we have to understand about this parsha, that if we want to have the continuity of the Jewish people, it's not enough to raise our children to be Jewish themselves. We have to make sure that they find spouses who will share that vision, who will help them raise Jewish families. I think that's one of the critical components of this parsha, that in the end, Yaakov is never married. No matter what, even though Esav is married already, Yaakov has never found somebody suitable to marry. That in and itself says that he's probably waiting to find an appropriate match. And that may be what swings the pendulum and says that he is the one who's got to find the right match, because the other one has already given up and found somebody who was not suitable. And so we as there's lots of lessons, lots of challenges in this regard. There's no question there are lots of questions in this parsha that we're going to struggle with. And the primary one being, to what extent are we allowed to bend the truth to reach a goal that we have to reach? And that's, as I said, a story for another whole night, another whole time, because there are lots of implications in that. But I think, as I said, I want to focus on the fact that Rivka because of where she came from and how she got to this family, realizes the importance of the wife in raising the family, in creating that atmosphere in a way that Yitzchak perhaps hasn't quite gotten. And I think that's really to me, that's the underlying message of the parsha. Even though we would have thought we had that last week with Eliezer, I think clearly that's the continuation of the story, and Rivka wants to make sure it happens. So thank you all. I hope you got something out of this. And if there are any questions, comments, I open the open mic if you have any questions or comments. So anybody out there in Zoom land?
I'd like to say